evening's program, and people start to come in. Let me be the first to welcome you. We're going to have an absolutely spectacular evening tonight with Charlotte Carty. We're delighted that she's agreed to do this for us, and it's good to have so many people joining live to support her as she goes through the story of Sherborne School and the influence and activities of Old Shirburnians in the Burma campaign. Absolutely amazing. For those of you who have done this before, you know it's pretty straightforward. Once we've got everyone in, I'll hand over to Sylvia. And if you've got any questions about the talk tonight, then certainly put them in the Q&A. And fill the chat up as well. That's really good stuff. And if we can't answer any questions tonight, then we'll do our best to answer them by email thereafter. And at some stage after the end of the talk, this will be available online. Well, that's enough for me. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's going to be really exciting. I'm delighted you're here. I'll now hand over to Sylvia May.
Well, thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first KET webinar of 2024. Lots of new names on the list tonight. Welcome, and always a warm welcome to our regulars. Happy New Year to everybody. Tonight is the first in what we hope might become a series of talks engaging individual schools as we take a look at the roles of their alumni in the Battle of Kohima and the whole of the Burma campaign. Tonight, the school in the limelight is Sherborne, and Charlotte Carty will present the story of how Old Shirburnians were involved in the Burma theatre of war from 1944 as part of Britain's forgotten army. Her presentation will focus in particular on old boys who fought at the Battle of Kohima, but will also cover others involved in Slim's 14th Army across a range of regiments and services, including the Chindits. Charlotte worked at Sherborne Prep School for many years, and together with their brilliant archivist Rachel Hassel, who has been magnificent from start to finish helping Charlotte prepare for this, Charlotte has also uncovered some wonderful stories. We are most grateful to David Leakey, Chair of Governors, whose idea it was to involve the Old Shirburnians, and Dominic Luckett, the headmaster, for allowing Charlotte such unlimited access to the archives. And also to John Harden and Anne McFarlane from the Old Shirburnian Society, who so generously embraced the project. But thank you all to you who have written in already to say that your children attend Sherborne, which means that it is often grandchildren and great-grandchildren of some of the veterans. So it is wonderful to think that we are reaching another generation. As always, we are in the capable hands of Dr. Robert Lyman, MBE. Rob is the author of many books covering the Burma campaign. His most recent publication is From Victory to Defeat, jointly authored with Lord Danett. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you all over to Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, very much. Well, my role tonight is going to be very short. I'm really, really pleased to be able to hand over to my friend Charlotte. Charlotte and I have just come back with a group of people from the hills of Nagaland, where we were for 2 weeks, and we were able to go out to Jasami and Karasom, places where her grandfather fought with the Assam regiment. And it's particularly good for Charlotte to become immersed in the history of her father's regiment over the last few years. And she's perfectly placed to be able to present to us tonight the story of one of Britain's great schools. And the reality is that during the Second World War, men and women joined up into the Britain's armed forces and the forces of the empire right across every branch of society, and the great schools of this country contributed very, very significantly, as we're going to hear tonight. You really don't want to hear too much from me tonight. It's all about Charlotte's research into the alumni of this incredible school, and we're delighted to have her with us. So without further ado, Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sylvia. It's my privilege to provide an insight this evening into how Old Shirburnians found themselves in World War II. I'm in a very small town called Kohima in the remote hills of Nagaland in northeastern corner of India, about 5,000 miles away from their old school in Dorset. So, the Battle of Kohima. It was a key turning point in the war in Southeast Asia. It was called the Stalingrad of the East. It marks the furthest point east that the Imperial Japanese Army managed to penetrate on land. It was a brutal and hard-fought campaign, and according to Earl Mountbatten, was probably one of the greatest battles in history. Indeed, the National Army Museum voted it Britain's greatest battle in 2013, ahead of battles such as Waterloo, Trafalgar, and indeed D-Day. But despite this, it's still not very well known. However, if the name and the details of the battle are unfamiliar to the majority, it's likely that most will know the following words. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Though these words are read at remembrance services around the world each year, and they are the Kohima epitaph from the Battle of Kohima itself. The exhortation reminds us of the sacrifice of the fallen and how they should never be forgotten. So, how is it that the battle came to this administrative town of Kohima in the Naga Hills? Well, a gallop through the first part of the Second World War, 1939, war broke out in Europe. 1940 saw Dunkirk. The Japanese then bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and that led to a lightning advance of the Japanese army through this area of the world, capturing Singapore in 1942, moving swiftly up the Malay Peninsula. They attacked Rangoon in March 1942, and as the Allies withdrew north, the Japanese threw themselves into hot pursuit. The withdrawing forces fell back into India on a very dangerous journey through Burma, fighting withdrawing actions as they went. And then they crossed into India across the hills. And one of the states that lies on the border, in these border hills, is Nagaland. And its capital is Kohima, ringed here. Now, there is a mountain range, or a sub-Himalayan range, running northeast, southwest through this area. There are different names for different parts of the hills in this area, but we're looking at the Naga Hills. And the Naga Hills, when you travel there, look something like this. And this photograph illustrates the sort of terrain the refugees from Burma were having to try to get through to evade the approaching Japanese. The withdrawing army had to overcome in order to get out of Burma ahead of the Japanese. And these would also be the mountains over which the Japanese would have to push any advancing force. And there was only one road at the time from Burma into India. It travelled through Tamil, then into Imphal, up to Kohima, turned a sharp left into east, and then onto the Brahmaputra Valley, coming out into the valley, out of the hills, at the roadhead, the railhead called Dimapur. Otherwise, there were just tracks through this terrain. So Delhi, HQ in Delhi, did not really believe it was realistic for the Japanese to push a sufficiently large army through this landscape, which would pose any kind of significant threat to the Allies at this time. So the Allies' main focus through 1943 was the restructuring and retraining of the army to face the strong Japanese threat that lay across the hills. One set of operations that were, though, going on during 1943 were the legendary Chindits. They were the largest of all the Allied special forces in the Second World War. Formed and led by Major General Ord Wingate, they fought behind enemy lines in northern Burma during 1943 and again in 1944. They were unconventional due to their total reliance on airdrops for their supplies and complete dependence on wireless communications. Wingate was a divisive figure, but he was loved by Churchill. He organised and specially trained the Chindits in commando methods, preparing them for the jungle fighting, the sabotage and the air supply dropping that they would have to get used to. The Chindits were intended to infiltrate deep behind the Japanese lines in northern Burma, and for many months they lived in and fought the enemy in the jungles of occupied Burma, hundreds of miles behind the Japanese forward positions. Their mission was to raid the enemy's lines of communications, blowing bridges, railway tracks and blocking supply routes. They would harass the enemy, cause confusion, disrupt their plans and divert their resources. It was an exceptionally tough mission, and only the very fittest soldiers were selected for these operations. Now, there were two Chindit expeditions into Burma. The first was in February 43, codenamed Operation Longcloth. It was an experimental operation to prove that British forces could operate many hundreds of miles from their own bases in the midst of enemy-controlled territory. It's largely agreed that it was a success. Indeed, such a success that perhaps it caught the eyes of the Japanese army as well to see whether they could, in some way, push through a large enough force through these hills. The second expedition was in March 1944 and was on a much larger scale than Operation Longcloth. It consisted of a force of 20,000 men, and its name was Operation Thursday. We have two Old Shirburnians who were Chindits. The first is Peter Duncard Davidson. He was a captain with the Royal Engineers and then was transferred to the Chindits. He was killed in action on the 24th of May 1944, aged just 24. In a letter to his family, Major General Letang on the 1st of July 1944 wrote, "Owing to the particular type of operations we engage in, it is very difficult for those who were with your son at the time of his death to write to you. Special Force is a new formation," interesting that he called it Special Force, "composed of personnel of the very highest physical and military standards. To have belonged to it is a great honour. In short, your son undertook cheerfully and with no thought of self a task that ranks with the most difficult and hazardous asked of any man in war." His mother replied, saying that they'd had two happy letters from him, written 200 odd miles behind enemy lines, in which he had said he was very well indeed and enjoying life a lot. She added that Sherborne days had always held happy memories for the boys. Our second Chindit is Douglas Vaughan Arthur Craddock. He was a major with the 4th 9th Gurkha Rifles, but also transferred to the Chindits. He was in Lion House, and it's thanks to the housemaster at the time, Trelawney Ross, that we have some of the information this evening. He kept his termly newsletters and correspondence with the boys' families and left them to the school archive. In a letter to his old housemaster, Craddock wrote that he had been a Chindit in 1944 and had survived. And surviving wasn't as simple as it might have sounded. It was an incredibly tough operation that they took part in. And this is a photograph of the Chindits in 1943, Operation Longcloth. You can see that they're bearded and thin, but they're still smiling despite the challenges that they were facing. So, March 1944, we have the Chindits, of course, still operating, but there's a bit of an impasse between the two armies, the Allied armies in India and the Japanese sitting in Burma, having consolidated all their gains over the past year. Now, the Japanese were considering whether to push into India through the Naga Hills, and at that time, the refreshed and retrained Allies were considering whether to begin their advance to push the Japanese out of Burma. In fact, it was the Japanese who moved first. Codenamed Operation Yugo, the invasion started on the 6th of March 1944 as the 31st Japanese Division under General Sato advanced across the Chinwin River, through the tracks in the Naga Hills, and they surrounded the town of Kohima. Now, there was I should actually say also here, this is the road. This is a Google map, a recent Google map, and it looks as if there are lots of roads. There weren't. That's the picture today. There was one road coming up from the south, from Burma, up through Imphal, carrying on to Kohima, here again ringed, and then turning east down onto the plains to come out at Dimapur, the road and railhead there. And there was much discussion in headquarters in Delhi as to which towns needed to be defended. Obviously, Imphal was a major centre, and that needed to be defended. But it did have the advantage of having flatland here, being on the Imphal plain, and therefore they had airfields, and so they could be supplied. So it was a major operation to protect Imphal, but they were able to supply it through air support. the question was, were the Japanese going to be attacking Kohima, or was their main goal trying to capture the railhead, the roadhead, Dimapur, where obviously there would be supplies which they would be very grateful to receive after their long trek up through Burma and through these hills. And it was really decided by HQ that it was much more likely that the point that they would take would be Dimapur. And as a result, by the time that the Japanese arrived at Kohima, there were barely any defensive troops in the perimeter here at all. And here we have a close-up of the Kohima Ridge. This is the one road. This goes down to Imphal and to the south, and it winds its way round the Kohima Ridge. Past this point, turns east and then down into the valley beyond, and keeping going down into Dimapur. That's the one road. And this was what was surrounded on April the 4th, 1944. The Kohima Ridge, behind us, as it were, where we're sitting on the screen, is a large mountain called Mount Pulabadzi. And we have the GPT Ridge is one of the spurs coming down to meet the rest of the ridge here. Along the ridge, you have, I suppose, then like knuckles on a fist of these raised little summits across the top. Jail Hill, DIS Hill, FSD, Fuel Supply Depot Hill, Cookie Piquet, Garrison Hill, IGH Spur, which is Indian General Hospital Spur, and then highlighted and large here is the bungalow sector. Bungalow sector is one of the key parts of the battle. The bungalow is actually the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow. This was Sir Charles Pawsey at the time. When I was saying it was an administrative centre, Kohima, this is where the administration took place. Pawsey was the sort of head of the administration of Nagaland, and he lived here in a lovely colonial bungalow at the top of this, the north end of this ridge, at the bottom of the terraces. And this steeply sloped area has lovely gardens with rhododendrons and pine trees, absolutely lovely. And at the top, there is the tennis court, the famous tennis court, as he was there. So this area was surrounded on the 4th of April, and the Battle of Kohima is split into two parts. There's the siege part, which takes place from the 4th to the 18th of April, and later the relief and the pushing back of the Japanese forces from the 18th of April through to the 20th of June. So looking at the siege part of the battle, there are about 1,500 Allied soldiers holding this perimeter. They were made up of the Royal West Kents, the Assam Regiment, the Assam Rifle, a Shear Regiment, and a few odds and sods who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were facing 15,000 Japanese. It was bitter hand-to-hand combat all along the Kohima Ridge. As far as we know, there were no Shirburnians in the siege section of the Battle of Kohima. However, their involvement came with the relieving force of the embattled garrison, and relief was coming up from Dimapur. And it was coming in the form of 5th Brigade, and it was composed of, amongst others, the Worcester Regiment, the Royal Berkshires Regiment, and the Dorset Regiment. Now, the Worcester Regiment was a TA regiment. Only two such regiments, only two TA regiments existed in the 14th Army. They set off from Dimapur on the 11th of April, 1944, and they were tasked with clearing the road up to Kohima. They met stiff resistance, fighting for 3 days at just one roadblock. And they were the first to be engaged on the road up to Kohima, and with them was the Old Shirburnian David Anthony Temple Phillips, MC. He was a lieutenant with the 7th Battalion of the Worcester Regiment. He actually enlisted from school underage. We know he led a patrol from Zubza, another village very close to Kohima, where the Allies had cleared an area on the 14th of April. Sadly, he was killed in action at Sangwe in Burma on the 14th of March 1945, just after the 7th Worcester to cross the Irrawaddy west of Mandalay. He was aged 22. His family received a letter from his regiment saying he was the perfect wartime soldier. A gallant spirit was he. With Phillips was another Shirburnian, Charles Arthur Street, Lieutenant Colonel to the South Staffordshire Regiment, but he was commanding the 7th Battalion of the Worcester Regiment. He also was killed in action on the 8th of February 1945 at the Battle of Duarte in Burma, during a fierce exchange on the banks of the Irrawaddy River, aged 41. So the relieving force was fighting its way up to the garrison, and they needed help. They were clinging on, but only just. You can see that the perimeter has now shrunk considerably. GPT Ridge has gone, Pimple has been taken, Jail Hill, Detail Hill, Supply Hill, Kirky Piquet, elements of the hospital spur as well. Even the district commissioner's, deputy commissioner's bungalow has been taken, and they have moved up the Japanese to the edge of the tennis court. And the fighting troops of the Allies are now within this small ringed area. This is how the positions were at dawn on the 18th of April. Supplies had to be airdropped onto this postage stamp sized drop zone. This included water, as there was no steady supply on the hill that had been cut by the Japanese very early on during the siege. And by the end of the siege, the soldiers were restricted to a pint of water a day for all needs. Ammunition was also running low, and the wounded could not be evacuated. The ADS was overflowing with many men lying in the open, totally unprotected. Sleep had been and was still hard to come by, as the Japanese attacked at night and shelled during the day. And the front line in this sector was across the tennis court of the deputy commissioner, so close was the fighting. And by this stage, there were probably only about 300 or 400 soldiers able to bear arms, and the perimeter had shrunk in size to about the size of 3 football pitches, so much smaller than the Carey's fields, and probably not much larger than the upper was the perimeter that they were trying to protect. And astonishingly, it was the night of the 17th of April going into the 18th of April that the Japanese took Kirky Piquet, and they took it early in the night. And it was expected, as they had on every other night, that they would continue and they would be coming onto Garrison Hill. And the soldiers on Garrison Hill were very well aware that they were really not up to defending any further at that point. But for some extraordinary reason, they didn't follow up. The Japanese didn't follow up that night. And thankfully, relief arrived in the form of the Punjab regiment filtering into the perimeter on the morning of the 18th of April. The next task was to evacuate the wounded, and this took place to the 18th and 19th of April. And on the 20th of April, the next stage of the relief began as soldiers from the Royal Berkshire Regiment made their way into the perimeter to take up positions defending Garrison Hill. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bickford, wrote, "I was profoundly shocked by the conditions that prevailed on Garrison Hill. The troops looked hollow-eyed, dirty, and had beards. The stench of festering corpses, Japanese, British, and Indian, was overpowering. There were no sanitary arrangements, and stores of all descriptions were just lying around. It was a veritable paradise for flies." Now, the Berkshires set up on Garrison Hill alongside the Punjabs, many just 15 yards from Japanese bunkers. The Berkshires were attacked relentlessly and indeed lost ground on the 24th of April, as the end of one of their trenches was taken by the enemy. It took them another 3 days before they could retake it. And with the Berkshires was Frank Michael Barton, MC. In the Lionhouse July 1944 newsletter, it was remarked that Barton had had a tough time in Burma and in the thick of fighting, but was very fit. He had had no clothes off for a fortnight, a slight wound, and what a beard. Also with the Berkshires was James Lowry Francis. He was a major in the battalion. He was killed in action in January 1945 whilst carrying out a personal reconnaissance, and he was shot by a sniper at close range, aged 24. Now, his family had already suffered when his older brother, Stephen, was killed in 1942. He was also an OS. He had been killed in Burma at Quabot Hill whilst he was with the West Yorkshire Regiment, and they were attacked by the advancing Japanese. Stephen had been awarded the DSO and twice mentioned in dispatches, and he held the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He was just 24. So the Berkshires suffered many casualties holding their positions, and this is a photograph of the memorial to the fallen men taken in 1944 at Kohima. It comes from a video of the Imperial War Museum's archives. The video contains some extraordinary footage capturing amongst other the total devastation on Garrison Hill immediately after the battle. And here are the positions in Garrison Hill where the Berkshires were fighting. And as you can see, another regiment was in the bungalow area alongside the Berkshires. And these were the Dorset Regiment, who was sent forward just a few days after the Berkshires. With them were 3 Old Shirburnians, Lieutenant King Fret, Captain Cheetle, and the second in command at the time, Oliver White. And here is a photograph of the second Dorset officers in 1942, just before they were mobilised, with all 3 Old Shirburnians in the frame. There's a lovely story told that when they embarked on their ship, they thought that they were heading to North Africa. And it was when the commanding officer called them onto deck and informed them that they were going to be going to India. That was the first that they knew of it. And the commanding officer took it upon himself to teach them all Urdu during the shipping across to India. So starting with the youngest of the 3 Old Shirburnians, here we find Henry Paget King Fret. King Fret was the first in action as well, on the 12th of April, as he was sent to occupy the village of Kohima near Kohima. The Japanese attacked on the 13th, but were unable to penetrate the Dorset positions and so withdrew. That night, King Fret guided a platoon of the Royal Berkshires as they tried to push up to relieve the besieged garrison at Kohima, probably the Berkshires we just talked about, and possibly Henry King Fret was with some of the Old Shirburnians as well. During this, though, he was wounded by a light machine gun, and it was a serious blow to the regiment as he was an outstanding company commander. The magnificent spirit shown by D Company in the actions which followed was largely down to his leadership over the past 16 months of the company. Next, we should remember Clive Cheetle, MC. Now, Clive was first involved at Kohima when he assisted with the evacuation of the wounded on the 18th and the 19th of April from Hospital Spur. And these were the positions of the Dorsets on Garrison Hill and the bungalow area. It was a task given to the Dorsets to clear the Japanese from the tennis court and to push on to retake the bungalow. There had been several attempts to regain the ground up to this point, but all had been held by the Japanese, who had very strongly entrenched and had strong defensive positions. It was not until a Lee Grant tank had been hand-winched up the steep side of Garrison Hill, which was another miraculous achievement in itself, and then it had bravely driven down the 8-foot drop onto the lower terrace and started firing at point-blank range into the well-dug-in and defended Japanese bunkers, that the D Company of the Dorsets charged across the tennis court and put the Japanese to flight. This is the famous Battle of the Tennis Court, and Cheetle led this charge. He was vital to its success, as was D Company, who had had King Fret as their company commander until just a week or so before, when he was wounded. I should say something more about the tanks. They had tried to get tanks up to this area before, but unfortunately all of those attempts had failed. So the sappers came in and they bulldozed a track straight up the side of IGH Spur, the Indian General Hospital Spur, which is slightly less steep than some of the other slopes in this area. Because of the steepness of the gradient, the state of the ground, it was awful. The continuous rain, because it was now the monsoon, the task of hand winching this tank took 24 hours. And it was an incredibly brave Sergeant Waterhouse from the RTR who sat in the tank and decided that he was going to go over the sheer 8-foot drop. Had they landed anything other than perfectly, they would have been sitting targets. So here is a picture painted by military artist Peter Dennis, and it captures Cheetle in this painting. This is supposed to be a picture of Cheetle as he is going in and clearing out the Japanese bunkers after the initial tennis court charge. Peter Dennis took the footage that there is in another incredible Imperial War Museum archive and took Peter Cheetle's face from that to use it in the painting here. And this footage, which you should go and have a look at on the Imperial War Museum archives, there's I would say there's a link to it there, but I don't want to press it because I know it won't work. But we can send it to people to go and have a look. It's absolutely extraordinary. There was a BBC correspondent who happened to be in the area at the time. His name was Richard Sharp, and he took some film of the attack as it was put in. I think it was probably as the mopping up operations were happening, but it still has pictures of the tank on the tennis court, and it has pictures of the men clearing out the positions. Richard Sharp actually followed the Dorsets all 800 miles down through Burma, and so there is some other footage that you can see which he took. And here are Clive Cheadle's medals. They're in the Keep Museum in Dorchester, the beautifully kept Devon and Dorset Regimental Museum. And here I should say a huge thank you to the team there, especially Elliot and Christopher, who've been so patient with me with all my requests for help. Now there was a third Old Shirburnian with them, Oliver White, or Knocker White as he was known. He took command of the Dorset shortly after the battle. He was second in command during the battle, and he was CO for the Dorsets for many years. He wrote a brilliant account of his time with the regiment, and the book Straight On for Tokyo is a fantastic read and a credit to his English teachers at Sherborne. Copies are available at the Keep Museum on the website if you're interested. So White arrived at Kohima on the 29th of April, and he said, "Like all who climbed up Garrison Hill for the first time, I was appalled by the situation. The reader must recall that heavy fighting had been taking place on these slopes in intense heat for nearly a month. So close had been and still was the fighting, and so heavy the sniping, that it had been impossible to collect the dead, even though, as in many cases, they lay just beyond the section post." Later White wrote, "I cannot leave Garrison Hill without a final word about our existence during the last 3 weeks. I have said enough to indicate how hugger-mugger we were all packed. Brigadier Wood, on a visit to us during the battle, likened it to one of the bloodier corners of the old Somme battlefield in the last war. Amidst all the stench, flies, and heat, life continued in the primitive way common to trench warfare." So the battle, the tennis court had been won, and the Dorsets had pushed on to take the bungalow, but the battle raged on for months. It had taken 2 weeks just to move across the tennis court, for example, and the perimeter was still perilously small. But during this time, other units were also moving up the road from Dimapur and attacking other areas around Kohima, including the Naga village, which is just across from Garrison Hill, across a small saddle in the hills there. And across the valley as well is the area called Church Knoll. And one OS who had been intimately involved in the events across from Garrison Hill was Hugh Modja. Modja had been part of the reinforcements at Kohima. The Punjabs had taken heavy casualties on Kohima Ridge on the 11th of May, and later they moved to Naga village on the 22nd of May. Modja was one of the captains that assaulted Church Knoll on the 29th of May, where he was wounded. He was evacuated, and once he had recovered, was appointed aide-de-camp to General Sir Oliver Lees, who was the commander-in-chief of Allied forces in Burma. Sadly, he was involved in a car accident in Kolkata and died of his injuries. Letters in the school archive show how sadly he was missed by all who knew him. And here are just a few slides to show the total devastation around the Garrison Hill. We have a before and after shot of the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow left, the lovely looking colonial bungalow where the administration for Nagaland took place. And then on the right, a little bit of one wall and a little bit of a chimney stack was all that remained. Here we have images of the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery just after it was being completed on the left. And then on the right, an up-to-date picture of the War Grave Cemetery taken in March 1923. This section here actually is the Dorset section. They tried to group the regiments together, the soldiers from the regiments together, and bury them together. And if they'd been fighting in the particular area, on this particular hill, they would try to place them as close to where they fell as possible. So here, this is the Dorset section. There are about 70 graves here. It's very moving. And this is an aerial photograph of the War Grave Cemetery, eloquently showing how steep some of these sides are. This is the road that leads down off to Imphal and on to Burma. This side goes down to Dimapur, having gone round Hospital Spur here, going off down to Dimapur. And you can see the terracing very clearly here. The Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, I believe, was about here, though Rob might tell me I'm wrong. And the tennis court, it was up here on the top level. And here's a close-up of the tennis court. When they built the cemetery, they decided to put in white cement the actual lines of the original tennis court to show where the fighting had taken place. And bringing us right back into Sherborne itself, this is in Sherborne Abbey in the Ladies' Chapel. This is a screen for the Dorsets, and you can see at the top that they're remembered with their battle honours of Kohima and indeed Mandalay. And that's where we're going to start heading now as we start moving on down through, pushing back into Burma and hopefully trying to retake Rangoon. It was a difficult and long road, and there were many OS involved in this stage of the campaign as well. John William Ellis, second lieutenant, whilst he was commissioned into the Gloucester Regiment, who was actually serving with the Suffolk Regiment at the time. And in the Lionhouse newsletter, he is reported to have been fighting in Burma in 1944 in the Arakan. We have Peter William Tyson, who was a lieutenant with the Royal Hampshire Regiment, attached to the 6th Battalion of the South Wales Borderers. He was also in the Arakan. He was killed in action on the 12th of November 1944, aged just 23, when it was a fierce action as the regiment pursued the withdrawing Japanese down the railway corridor near Pinway in Burma. It was a 5-day battle with the Japanese 128th Infantry Regiment having dug in strongly into defensive positions. Over 157 Allied soldiers were lost in this fight alone, Tyson being one of them. We have David Martin Colmore. He was with the RAF, Volunteer Reserve, as a pilot. He joined Indian Command in December 43 and carried out many solo missions over the Chindits Hills in Burma, possibly supporting the Chindits, possibly some OS who were on the ground beneath him. He was killed in action on the banks of the River Chindwin, about 80 miles from Imphal, when his single-seater Hurricane crashed on the night of the 24th of May, 1944. He was aged just 21. We also have Dennis Seymour Hawkins. He was a lieutenant with the Royal Engineers. He died of typhus whilst on active service in Imphal on the 15th of August 1944, aged just 20. So the soldiers were not only fighting the Japanese, disease was a major issue for the 14th Army in the Far East. The Shirburnian of December 1944 wrote how he had had an outstanding career at Sherborne, and no one could help loving Dennis for his vigorous sense of humour, his sturdy forthrightness, and his loyalty. He was an unselfish Shirburnian. And still the Allies pushed south, trying to push on to Mandalay. And here we find Peter Roderick Oliver. He was a lieutenant colonel commanding the 9th Battalion, the 13th Frontier Force Rifles, also known as the Coax Rifles. Before the war, Oliver had been selected for the Everest expeditions of 1936 and 1938. He was the only person actually to have had that honour of being selected for both expeditions. He was killed in action by sniper fire on the 22nd of February 1945 at Tangatha in Burma, and the general commanding the division wrote, "He was a true son of Sherborne, a fine leader, modest, and a great gentleman," aged 37. And the school archives holds a collection of Oliver's belongings from his Everest expeditions. Do ask Rachel Hassel, the school archivist, if you'd like to see them. They are again lovely and well worth a trip to see Rachel and all of the items in the archive. We also find Michael Harry Tennant Cowan of the 1st 6th Gurkhas. He died of wounds received in action during the advance of Mandalay at Shwebo in Burma on the 6th of March 1945, aged just 23. Stephen William Wilcox. He was a major with the Lancers of the Indian Armored Corps attached to Headquarters 19th Indian Division. He died from wounds sustained at Mandalay on the 21st of March, 1945, aged just 39. And the fighting continued as the Allies pushed further down. And we come across Hugh Robin Guy Bremner. He was a captain with the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, attached to the 2nd Battalion of the Gold Coast Regiment. So he was killed in action on the 22nd of April 1945 during the last stages of the expulsion of the Japanese from the Arakan, aged 30. Now this regiment, the Gold Coast Regiment, was extraordinary as they had experienced 9 months of only receiving supplies through air support, through airdrops, as they pushed south. Quite remarkable. And pushing even further south down into Rangoon, we find Walter Edward Kennard. He was a lieutenant commander of HMS Odyssey of the Royal Navy. He was killed in action on the 3rd of May 1945 as he went to the rescue of another stricken ship at the recapture of Rangoon. He had actually been on HMS Ajax at the Battle of the River Plate in the South Atlantic earlier in the war, and had found himself in North Africa at Tobruk as the town was besieged, and then had to fight through the siege of Tobruk itself as well. And he was known at Sherborne as a good companion with a whimsical humour and a highly developed sense of fun. He was aged 32. We have Vivian Henry Spencer Hannay, a Madras sapper and miner. He would have been building airfields for the RAF during the Burma campaign, most likely at Imphal. He was later awarded an MC during the Korean War, and he retired as a colonel. We have Eric Hammett Fairfax Beedon, and he was an assistant director of the Intelligence Bureau in New Delhi. So the OS are involved in all areas of the war, all services of the war, all different regiments of the forces. And I couldn't help adding in this photograph too that Rachel Hassel found for me, showing Beedon here sitting in the 2nd row. And in the front row, sitting cross-legged on the far left here, is one Alan Turing. How extraordinary that these two men were sitting so close together when they were younger, and they both ended up in the war working in intelligence. But there are more, of whom I have unfortunately less detail. Bruce Michael Ross McGenty, he was a flight lieutenant with the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. He was killed in action on the 13th of November 1943 at Imphal in an accident on an operational flight, aged just 21. Anthony Baird Scott, he was a captain with the 1st Battalion of the 4th Prince of Wales Own Gurkha Rifles. He was killed in action in the Chin Hills in Burma on the 14th of December 1943 during an action to retake milestone 22 on the Tyndon Road during a night attack. He was just 21. John Priestley Oates, he was a captain in the Burma Regiment, and he was wounded in December 1943. Anthony Wenham Humphrey Davis MC was a major in the Royal Artillery attached to the 6th Battery of the 3rd Field Regiment of the Royal Indian Artillery. He was killed in action on the 24th of March 1944, and the regiment was part of the 23rd Indian Division. And on the 24th of March, it was just after the Japanese invasion of India, and on that date, the 6th Battery was cut up badly in an ambush near Morang, east of Imphal, where it lost 3 of its 4 guns. And so it's likely that this is where he lost his life, aged 30. John Malcolm Patterson was a lieutenant with the 12th Frontier Force. He wrote to his old housemaster that he'd been fighting in Burma since 1943. Prior to the war, when he was still at school, he had written an account of the bombing of Sherborne School in September 1940, when the Germans dropped their bombs as they were flying back after one of their missions. We also have Henry James Stockley, lieutenant on the Duke of Wellington's regiment. He wrote to his housemaster in 1944, he had his fling in Burma. Now, the 2nd Battalion of the Duke of Wellington's regiment had regrouped in India after the long retreat out of Burma, and they had become part of the 23rd Independent Infantry Brigade. They were in action around Kohima and Imphal, operating on the Japanese flanks until the Japanese withdrawal. We also have Philip Walter Milburn Burt. He was a captain with Duke of Wellington's regiment attached to the South Wales Borderers, and he served in Burma in June 44 and was wounded in February 45. He was part of a British unit, actually, which was put under American control as they were supporting the Chinese troops under US General Stilwell, who were pushing south from North Burma. He also gave an interview to two boys who were doing a research project at Sherborne, and this is a digital file which is also held in the archives, so do speak to Rachel Hassel if you'd like to hear it. He mentions during that interview how the Chindits withdrew through his division when his division were taking over, and he did say that they were skin and bone, a pathetic sight, and totally flaked out. We also find George Edward Reelstick Baston. He was a brigadier commanding the 27th Infantry Brigade, which was a field regiment in Burma in 1943. We have Michael Aldridge Kidner. He was a captain with the Royal Artillery. In 1944, he was posted to India. He moved to Kohima in November, and a walk up Lone Tree Hill was his first introduction to a battlefield. On the top of the hill, he wrote, there was all the refuse of war, slit trenches, bunkers, torn and rotting clothing and equipment, and almost a deathly silence. On the 1st of January 1945, he started moving south with his unit and met action at Kandor. The division crossed the Irrawaddy River, and their task was to secure the bridge so the Allies could start their move south. He moved 12 miles north as a forward observation officer and directed fire into strong enemy positions. We find Michael Hall, or Edward Michael Hall, but he was known as Michael Hall. He was also at Lion House and a major commanding Indian Field Company. He fought at the Battle of the Admin Box in the Arakan in February 1943. Later, he was president of the OS Society in 1974. We also find John Myrmidon, who was a major in the Royal Artillery, and he fought the Japanese in the Arakan with the 5th Indian Division, which was airlifted into the siege of Imphal, where he remained until the Japanese siege there was broken by the British troops coming south from Kohima. He was unable to accompany the division chasing the Japanese into Burma, as he had to be invalided out into Darjeeling, having contracted scrub typhus just like Dennis Seymour Hawkins. He remained in the army after the war, and he reached the rank of colonel. Now, there are many more who were likely to be fighting in this theatre of war, Old Shirburnians, that we don't know about. Much of the work has relied on obituaries, but many may have survived and just not informed school of their service. Indeed, a couple of names we've actually had to add to the talk this evening after the registration details went out as families came forward with new information. And I've been quite narrow in the task of looking at the various soldiers, Old Shirburnians. I've tried to narrow it down to the late 1943 to early 1945. But we know that there were more involved in Burma earlier in the war. And one example of this was George Bellicott, who was also Limehouse, and he was the Royal Engineer. And he recorded his flight from the Japanese advance in his own memoir, which is entitled Pink Rice, which he illustrated with his own drawings of his experiences. He was one of the last to get out and being hotly pursued by the Japanese. Rachel has a PDF of this archive in the school archives. It's an extraordinary read. So if you'd like to read it, look at it, see the illustrations, do please get in touch with Rachel. She'd be delighted to help. There are also 31 prisoners of war listed in the school archives who were taken prisoner in 1942 as the Japanese took Singapore and then advanced to the Malay Peninsula and beyond. So in summary this evening, we've actually talked about 33 Old Shirburnians. We know that there were 31 prisoners of war, at least in 1942 in the archives. Sherborne lost 248 of its old boys in World War II, which compares to 221 in World War I. So coming back to the Kohima epitaph, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. And that's what we were aiming to do this evening. to make sure that the Old Shirburnians who are out with the forgotten army are never forgotten. Thank you.
It's brilliant, Charlotte. Really, really interesting. And a massive thank you for all the research you've done and the time you've given to this subject. I think everyone's found it really interesting. Rob, did you want to take any questions?
We've only had one Q&A about the Royal Scots at Kohima. If you'd like to add your questions in the Q&A, then feel free to do so, or email them to us. You can find our addresses online. But if there aren't any pressing questions, I think we go back to you, Sylvia.
Okay, well, if there are some in the chat, because I know a lot of you have been, excuse me, involved in the chat. So if we pick up any of the questions tomorrow, we'll, as Rob said, come back to you separately. And I'd like to just give Charlotte and Rob a big plug. They're walking 78 miles through Nagaland in March, at the end, well, in April, actually, along with others. They're following in the footsteps of Charlotte's grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel, excuse me, Felix Brown, who 80 years ago on that very day, 1st of April, began that journey and completed it in 39 hours, a time that Charlotte is endeavouring to replicate. We wish them all huge success, and hopefully we can get Charlotte back on to talk about the journey and to give another webinar. May I remind you, here's the quick plug before you all go, about our online shop, where you will find lots of Naga jewellery, bags and shawls available, all made in Nagaland. And of course, all of Rob's books are available to purchase as well. We also stock some Naga publications, and the winning titles in the Gordon Graham Prize for Naga Literature are available there. Also in stock, of course, is our especially commissioned poppy pin commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Kohima. And all proceeds, as I think you know, generously go to KET because the RBL donated them to us. Our next webinar will be a pre-recorded presentation on the role of the RAF in the battle, focusing on the specific role of the Dakota. Terence O'Halloran, curator of the 31st Squadron Association, has put together an excellent recording, which we look forward to bringing you on February the 15th. May I also remind you all about the weekend in April 20th and 21st, when the National Army Museum, together with KET, are hosting a weekend of talks, when the highlight will be Rob Lyman in discussion with Lord Slim about Slim's grandfather. Well, in the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and look forward very much to seeing you next time. Bye for now.